to Sacred Arc, a podcast about life, loss, and the soul in between. I'm Kimberly, intuitive grief guide, death doula, licensed esthetician, and whether I wanted to be or not, a lifelong student of grief. For a lot of people, losing a grandparent is the first time they experience grief, but it doesn't always feel like it's treated the same way because it's expected. It's something people know is going to happen at some point. And because of that, it often gets approached differently. More matter of fact, less held, less talked about in terms of what it actually feels like. And when something is expected, it can create this unspoken idea that it should be easier, that you should be more prepared, that it shouldn't affect you in the same way as other losses. But that's not how grief works. Because even when you know something is coming, it doesn't change what that person meant to you. It doesn't change what they represented in your life, and it doesn't make their absence feel any less real when they're gone. People might say things like, they lived a long life, at least you had them for so long, or this is just a part of life, you knew this was coming. And again, those things can be true, but they don't always land because they don't really speak to the experience of the loss. They don't speak to what it feels like to not have that person here anymore. And what can happen is you start to feel like you're not supposed to feel it as deeply, or like your grief needs to be quieter, more contained, more acceptable. And because of that, a lot of people don't fully express it. They don't talk about it. They move through it in a way that feels more internal, more private, sometimes even pushing it aside without realizing it, because it doesn't feel like something that's meant to take up as much space. But grief isn't about how expected something is. It's about connection. And if there was connection, there will be impact. Grandparents can represent something very specific in our lives. For some people, they're a sense of safety, a place you could go without needing to explain yourself, without needing to perform or meet expectations, just being accepted as you are. For others, they're a kind of consistency, someone who was always there in a way that felt steady, predictable, grounding. And that kind of presence can be more important than we realize at the time. For some, their connection to family, to history, to stories about where you came from. They hold memories that you don't have access to anywhere else. And when they're gone, that connection can feel like it shifts or even fades. And for others, they're the person who showed up in a way that no one else did, the one who made you feel seen or cared for or understood, sometimes even filling roles that were missing elsewhere. And when someone like that is gone, it's not just the loss of them, it's the loss of what they gave you, the role they held, the space they created in your life, and that can leave a kind of absence that isn't always easy to explain. Because this kind of loss is expected, it often isn't fully processed in the moment, especially if it happens when you're younger. You might not have had the language to understand what you were feeling. You might not have been asked about it or given space to talk about it. You might have seen other people grieving, your parents, your family, and felt like their grief was bigger or more important. So yours became something quieter, something you carried without really knowing what to do with it. And sometimes you didn't even realize that you didn't process it. Because life keeps moving, things continue, and the loss just kind of gets folded into everything else. But that doesn't mean it's gone. It just means it hasn't been fully felt yet. And because of that, this kind of grief can show up later, in ways that feel unexpected. It might show up in small moments, hearing something they used to say, smelling something that reminds you of them, or being in a place you used to go together. Or in bigger moments, milestones, life changes, times when you would have called them. And suddenly you feel it again, not as a memory, but as something present, something active. And sometimes it shows up through other losses, where something about the feeling is familiar. Like your body remembers it before your mind connects it. Because grief doesn't disappear when it's not processed. It just waits for a moment where it has space to be felt. For me, losing my grandma wasn't just losing a grandparent. She was my best friend. I spent almost every weekend with her growing up, and my home life, as I've mentioned before, wasn't always easy. So being with her felt like a completely different space. She was safe. She was steady. She was someone I could just be with. And without her, I honestly don't know if I would have grown into the woman I am today. I know I would have never gotten into horses the way I did. She's the one who introduced me and took me to my riding lessons. And that became such a big part of my life. So even in that way, her presence shaped me more than I probably realized at the time. She was also an incredible role model, a strong woman. She'd been on her own for many years after my grandfather passed, and she never remarried. But she built a life that was full. She was welcoming, kind to everyone, and also just silly in all the best ways. There was a lightness to her, a warmth. And when everything in my life felt stressful, she was the person I called, always. And one of the things I loved about her was that even if I called her crying, which I did quite a bit, she would say, "Let me see you smile." And I remember I'd brush it off and be a little frustrated, like, "Grandma, now's not the time for that." But then she would ask me again and I would smile, even over the phone. And somehow it actually made me feel better every single time. And it's those kinds of things that stay with you, not just the big memories, but the way that someone made you feel, the way they showed up for you, the way they held space in your life. So when she was gone, it wasn't just her, it was that space too. There's also something about this kind of loss that can be more layered than we expect, because it's not just the person, it's everything they represented, the role they played in your life, the version of you that existed with them. In losing my grandmother, it was losing that place I could go when things felt overwhelming. Losing the person who brought a kind of calm into my life when everything else felt stressful. It was losing that feeling of knowing I could pick up the phone and she would be there. And when something like that is gone, there can be a shift in how safe things feel, how supported you feel, and how you move through certain moments. And that kind of grief isn't always obvious from the outside, but it's real, and it lives in those quieter spaces. There's also another layer to this, and that's the experience of losing a grandparent you never actually met or never really got to know. Because that kind of loss can feel different, but it's still very real. For some people, there's a sense of curiosity, questions that never got answered, stories you've only heard pieces of, a person you know existed but don't have your own memories with, and that can create a different kind of grief, not based on shared experiences, but based on what was never there to begin with. It's the loss of possibility. The relationship that didn't get the chance to exist in your life, the conversations you never had, the connection you didn't get to form. And sometimes it's also tied to identity, because grandparents often hold parts of your history, your family history, where you came from. And when that connection isn't there, it can feel like something is missing, even if you can't fully explain it. And because there aren't memories, this kind of grief can be easy to dismiss. You might tell yourself, "I didn't even know them. Shouldn't matter that much," or "it's not the same." But grief isn't just about what you had, it's also about what you didn't get. Sometimes it shows up in quiet ways, wondering what they were like, looking for pieces of them in other people or even yourself, trying to understand what parts of your story connect back to them. And just like other forms of grief, it doesn't need to be compared to be valid. It doesn't need to be justified, it just needs to be acknowledged for what it is. Because whether you knew them deeply or not at all, there's still a thread. And when that thread is missing, you can feel it. Another layer to this kind of loss is what happens to the family sometimes after that person is gone. For my family, my grandma was the one who held everything together. She was the reason we gathered, the reason we saw each other, holidays, birthdays, just time together. It all centered around her. And when she was here, there was a sense of connection, a rhythm to it, a feeling that no matter what was going on in everyone's individual lives, we would still come back together. And after she passed, that changed, not all at once, but over time. Things became more complicated. There were decisions that had to be made, different perspectives, different interpretations of what should happen next. And what I didn't fully understand at the time was that when the person who holds everything together is gone, sometimes the structure changes too. And in some ways, it can feel like you're not just grieving them, you're grieving what existed because of them, the way things used to be, the connection that felt more consistent, the access you had to people just through being together. And over time, that can shift into distance, into people going different directions, into relationships that aren't as close as they once were. And that can be extremely hard to process because it's not one clear loss. It's gradual, it's subtle, but it's real. There are people in my family that I haven't seen in years. Not because anything specific happened between us, but because the thing that connected us isn't there in the same way anymore. And I think that's something a lot of people experience but don't always name. That when you lose someone like that, you don't just lose the person, you lose the dynamic they created. And for me, that just reinforces how much my grandmother held, how much she gave, not just individually, but to all of us. Grief in this space isn't something that just needs to be minimized. Just because it's common. It's still a relationship. It still mattered. And honoring that relationship doesn't mean holding on to pain forever. Doesn't mean staying stuck in the loss. It just means allowing what was there to be seen for what it was. Letting yourself remember them, talk about them, say their name, laugh at the things they used to. Hold on to the parts of them that shaped you. Because even though they're not here anymore, doesn't mean the relationship disappears. It just changes, but the impact stays. And sometimes honoring them isn't about doing anything big. It's just about allowing yourself to feel that connection without pushing it away. When it comes to this kind of grief, there isn't a right way to move through it. There isn't a timeline. And there isn't a point where you're supposed to feel like you're over it. And I say that in quotations. Because for a lot of people, this is one of those losses that quietly stays with you. And sometimes what helps isn't trying to make it go away. Sometimes what helps is just letting it be there. Letting yourself miss them when you miss them. Letting yourself think about them without telling yourself you shouldn't still feel this way. Sometimes it looks like remembering the things that made them, them. The little habits, the way they spoke, the things they would say to you, like, let me see you smile. And maybe now that shows up differently. Maybe now it's something you remember in your own moments. Something that still shifts how you feel, even though they're not here to say it. And sometimes what helps is realizing that grief isn't something you move past. It's something you learn to carry differently over time. If you're listening to this today, and something in this episode felt close to your heart, whether it brought up memories or feelings you haven't had space for in a while, I just want you to know that you don't have to carry it all at once. If you're listening to this and you're carrying this kind of loss, whether it felt big or quiet, expected or more complicated than people realized, I hope this gave you a little bit of space to recognize it, to feel it without minimizing it. Because grief isn't about how something is supposed to feel, it's about what it meant to you. Before we close, if you can, just take a moment here for yourself. You can close your eyes if that feels okay, and place one hand over your heart and one hand over your stomach. Just letting your body settle for a second. Take a slow breath in through your nose and a slow breath out through your mouth. And if you're able to, I want you to gently bring to mind your grandparent or whatever they represent to you, the feeling of them, the way they showed up, the love that was there. And I'm going to say the same thing to you my grandmother used to say to me, even when I was upset. Let me see you smile. It was never about ignoring what I was feeling. It was about softening it just a little. So if it feels okay, let yourself smile, even just slightly. Not because everything is okay, but because you're allowing a small moment of lightness to exist alongside everything else. Let that feeling move through you, that warmth, that connection, that love that still exists. And just remember, you don't have to carry this alone. This has been Sacred Arc. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you again in the space between.